The world at war. How the Axis seemed unstoppable. The year was 1940, and the world stood on the edge of despair. Across Europe, Nazi banners flew over conquered capitals. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The mighty British army had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, and the rest of the continent lay in chains. In Asia, Japan was expanding with ruthless efficiency, capturing vast territories across China and threatening Western colonies in the Pacific. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, appeared unstoppable. But to understand why the Allies ultimately won, we must first understand why, in those early years, the Axis looked destined for victory. This was not a war the Allies were winning in the beginning. It was a war of survival. The shock of Blitzkrieg Germany's strategy was unlike anything the world had seen before. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined tanks, aircraft, and infantry in a fast-moving storm that overwhelmed enemy defenses before they could react. Poland was crushed in weeks. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands fell with frightening speed. France, with its proud military tradition and the formidable Maginot Line, was swept aside in a matter of days. The Allies, stuck in old ways of fighting, were stunned. Their soldiers marched, their tanks crawled, and their generals clung to outdated strategies. Hitler's Wehrmacht, meanwhile, struck with precision and ferocity. To many watching at the time, it seemed that nothing could stop this machine. But what happened next would change everything. Britain stands alone in 1940. After France's collapse, only one major power in Europe remained free: Britain. Hitler expected the British to sue for peace. Instead, Winston Churchill's government vowed to fight on, no matter the cost. But this was no empty boast. The Luftwaffe unleashed the Battle of Britain, an aerial onslaught designed to break British resistance. For months, German bombers rained destruction on London, Coventry, and countless other cities. Civilians huddled in shelters as firestorms consumed neighborhoods. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Britain endured the Blitz with grit and determination, and slowly, the tide began to turn. The Royal Air Force, equipped with radar technology and superior fighter planes like the Spitfire and Hurricane, inflicted devastating losses on the Luftwaffe. The Germans had not planned for such resistance. Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. For the first time, the Axis war machine had stumbled. Still, this was only a small victory. Across the globe, the Axis continued to advance. Japan on the rise while Europe burned. Japan carved out an empire in Asia. Since 1937, Japanese forces had waged a brutal war in China, committing atrocities such as the infamous Nanjing Massacre. By 1941, Tokyo's ambitions extended further. The goal was nothing less than dominance over the Pacific. Japan's leaders believed Western powers were weak and distracted. They underestimated American resolve. In December 1941, they launched a daring strike at Pearl Harbor, crippling much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack stunned the world and drew the United States fully into the war. Japan also struck simultaneously at British, Dutch, and American territories. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines all fell to the rising sun flag in a matter of months. It looked as if Japan would dominate Asia. Once again, the Allies appeared on the brink of defeat. The Soviet gamble, if the early victories of Germany and Western Europe were shocking, what came next was staggering. In June 1941, Hitler turned eastward and unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks and aircraft, stormed across the frontier in the largest land invasion in history. The Soviet Union was caught off guard. Entire armies were encircled. Millions of prisoners were taken. Cities fell one after another. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. For Stalin and the Soviet people, it seemed the end was near. But the Soviets refused to surrender. As temperatures dropped, the Red Army launched a desperate counteroffensive. German troops, ill-prepared for the brutal Russian winter, froze in their trenches. The myth of an invincible Wehrmacht began to crack, but few could see it clearly at the time. The world on fire by late 1941, the war stretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Axis forces occupied Paris, Warsaw, Athens, and Manila. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. Japanese armies marched through Burma, threatening India. The Allies were fighting on multiple fronts, outnumbered and outgunned. Their cities were bombed, their colonies invaded, their armies beaten back. From London to Moscow to Washington, leaders questioned how long they could endure. It seemed that the Axis, ruthless and united, had all the momentum. The Allies were divided by geography, language, and politics. How could such a coalition of democracies and empires hope to stand against the disciplined, aggressive Axis powers? And yet, the story of World War II is not one of inevitable defeat. The very strengths that allowed the Axis to rise so quickly would also sow the seeds of their downfall. For hidden beneath the chaos of 1940 to 41 were forces that would soon tilt the balance of the war. But what happened next would change everything. Industry, innovation, and the power of production, the Axis powers had momentum, but wars are not won by speed alone. Behind every soldier, tank, and bomber lies the power of industry. And here, the Allies had an advantage so overwhelming it would, in time, decide the war. The Second World War was not only fought on battlefields, it was fought in factories, shipyards, and laboratories. Victory depended on who could build, supply, and innovate the fastest. America awakens as the arsenal of democracy. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America seemed badly wounded. Battleships lay in ruins, sailors were dead, and the Pacific Fleet was crippled. Yet what Japan's leaders had failed to grasp was the sheer scale of American industry. Within months, U.S. shipyards were turning out new vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Aircraft factories ran day and night, producing fighters, bombers, and transports on a staggering scale. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had already foreseen the coming storm. Even before America officially entered the war, he had promised to make the United States the arsenal of democracy. Through the Lend-Lease program, America supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies with tanks, trucks, planes, food, and fuel. This flow of resources kept nations in the fight at moments when collapse seemed imminent. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year. Liberty's ships, simple, mass-produced cargo vessels, were built in weeks, not months. One shipyard in California even set a record by completing an entire ship in just 4 days. While German factories struggled under Allied bombing and Japanese industry lacked resources, America's production only grew stronger. But production alone was not enough. It had to be delivered where it was needed most. Logistics. The lifeline of victory wars are often lost, not because armies are beaten in battle, but because they run out of supplies. The Allies understood this better than anyone. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, victory depended on fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. The United States, with its vast resources, built fleets of cargo ships to carry supplies across the oceans. Convoys guarded by destroyers and escorted by aircraft carriers kept Britain alive during its darkest days. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking thousands of ships, but Allied innovations like sonar, radar, and long-range patrol planes eventually turned the tide. In Russia, American trucks became the backbone of the Red Army. While Soviet factories produced tanks and guns, the United States sent over 500,000 trucks, allowing Soviet forces to move quickly across the vast steppes. One Soviet general later admitted that without American vehicles, the Red Army would have been forced to haul supplies with horses. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every drop of gasoline that reached the front lines was as important as any soldier carrying a rifle. Logistics was not glamorous, but it won battles. Innovation on the battlefield industrial power was not just about numbers. It was also about innovation. The Allies invested heavily in science and technology, often outpacing the Axis in critical areas. Radar allowed Britain to detect incoming German bombers during the Battle of Britain, giving the Royal Air Force precious minutes to scramble fighters. Code breaking at Bletchley Park, where British and Polish mathematicians cracked the Enigma code, allowed the Allies to read German messages and anticipate attacks. New weapons like the proximity fuse, which made anti-aircraft fire vastly more accurate, devastated German planes and Japanese kamikazes. Medical advances, including mass production of penicillin, saved millions of lives on the battlefield and at home. Perhaps most important was the development of the atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project. While this secret effort would not bear fruit until 1945, it symbolized how Allied science was mobilized for total war. Meanwhile, German innovation often worked against them. Advanced weapons like the V-2 rocket and jet fighters came too late and in too few numbers to alter the course of the war. The Allies had mastered not just invention, but mass production. The Soviet miracle of production, while America provided the bulk of resources, the Soviet Union also demonstrated astonishing industrial resilience. When German armies invaded in 1941, Soviet factories faced destruction. Stalin made a desperate gamble. Entire industries were dismantled and shipped thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. In freezing conditions, often with little more than hand tools, workers rebuilt factories in the Urals and Siberia. By 1942, these factories were turning out tanks, artillery, and aircraft at an incredible pace. The legendary T-34 tank, simple, rugged, and deadly, became the backbone of the Red Army. It could be produced in massive numbers and repaired easily in the field. Soviet industry, combined with American Lend-Lease aid, gave the Red Army the tools it needed not just to survive, but to strike back. Total war. Societies mobilized World War II was a total war, demanding sacrifice not just from soldiers, but from entire societies. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, from American Rosie the Riveters to Soviet women welding tanks. Farmers grew record harvests, children collected scrap metal, and scientists abandoned peacetime research to work on military projects. The Axis powers, by contrast, failed to fully mobilize until it was too late. Nazi Germany, under Hitler's mismanagement, resisted putting women into factories and continued to rely on forced labor from occupied nations. Japan's industry lacked access to oil, steel, and rubber, and was strangled by Allied blockades. The contrast was stark. While the Axis powers fought with ferocity, the Allies fought with resources, machines, and innovation on a scale the world had never seen. By 1943, the industrial tide was unmistakable. Allied armies were better supplied, better fed, and better armed. German and Japanese soldiers often fought with courage, but courage could not replace tanks, planes, and fuel. The war was shifting, but production and innovation were only part of the story. The Allies were not a single nation. They were a coalition of democracies, empires, and ideologies. How did such different nations, often with conflicting goals, manage to fight together? The answer lies in unity. But what happened next would change everything. Unity in diversity. How Allied nations worked together at first glance. The Allies were an unlikely coalition. Britain was an empire fighting for survival, the Soviet Union a communist dictatorship, and the United States a democracy with deep isolationist traditions. China, under Chiang Kai-shek, was already exhausted after years of war against Japan. On paper, these nations had little in common, and in fact, they often distrusted one another. It was precisely this diversity, this ability to combine resources, strategies, and strengths that gave the Allies an edge over the Axis. The Axis powers, bound together by opportunism rather than true cooperation, often acted in isolation. Hitler ignored Japanese interests. Mussolini pursued reckless campaigns without German support, and Japan kept its war in Asia separate from Germany's war in Europe. By contrast, the Allies, despite frequent disagreements, built mechanisms of coordination that allowed them to act as a united force. This unity did not come easily. It was forged through diplomacy, compromise, and sheer necessity. Britain, the island that refused to follow Britain's role, was not only military, but also symbolic. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone in Europe. Winston Churchill's defiance inspired both his people and future allies. His speeches echoed across the Atlantic, convincing Americans that Britain would not collapse. Britain also became a staging ground, a fortress from which the Allies could launch their return to Europe. Though bombed and battered, Britain hosted American forces, coordinated with resistance movements across the continent, and served as a hub for intelligence and planning. Churchill himself worked tirelessly to keep the alliance together. He traveled across the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt, across the Mediterranean to negotiate with Stalin, and across the globe to rally colonial troops. Britain's strength was not in numbers or resources. It was in diplomacy and endurance. The Soviet Union, bleeding for victory if Britain symbolized defiance. The Soviet Union symbolized sacrifice. No nation paid a higher price for victory than the USSR. From 1941 onward, the Red Army absorbed the full fury of the Wehrmacht. The battles of Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Kursk were among the largest and bloodiest in history. By some estimates, the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people during the war. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, entire families wiped out. Yet, despite this unimaginable suffering, the Soviets refused to surrender. Stalin knew that retreat was not an option. He famously declared, "Not a step back." This determination tied down the bulk of German forces on the Eastern Front. While the Western Allies fought in North Africa and Italy, more than three-quarters of German divisions were locked in a brutal struggle with the Red Army. Without the Soviet Union's resilience, the Allies could not have won. Still, the alliance between Stalin and the Western powers was fragile. Deep mistrust existed. Churchill and Roosevelt feared communism, while Stalin believed the West deliberately delayed opening a second front in France. Yet despite suspicions, they fought together because the alternative, defeat, was unthinkable. The United States. From isolation to superpower before the war, many Americans wanted no part in European or Asian conflicts. But Pearl Harbor shattered isolationism overnight. Suddenly, the United States was not just in the war, it was determined to win it. American forces flooded into Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. But America's greatest contribution was not only military, it was leadership. Roosevelt recognized that victory required cooperation on a global scale. He pushed for joint command structures, international conferences, and shared goals. The U.S. military brought fresh manpower, modern equipment, and vast naval power. American bombers joined the British in pounding German cities. In the Pacific, U.S. Marines fought brutal island-hopping campaigns against Japan. With every passing year, the U.S. grew into the role of global superpower, shaping not just the outcome of the war, but the world that would follow. China and the Forgotten Front, often overlooked in Western histories. China was a critical part of the Allied struggle. Since 1937, Chinese forces had tied down over 1 million Japanese soldiers. Though poorly equipped and plagued by internal divisions between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, China's resistance prevented Japan from committing its full strength against the United States and Britain. The war in China was brutal. Cities were bombed, villages destroyed, and millions of civilians killed. Yet China's endurance stretched Japan thin, forcing Tokyo to fight on multiple fronts. Allied support flowed through the dangerous Burma Road, and later through aerial supply missions over the Himalayas, the famous hump. Though often underappreciated, China's role was vital to the overall balance of the war. Conferences and coordination, one of the greatest achievements of the Allies, was their ability to plan together. Major conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, brought Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin face to face. Despite clashing ideologies, they hammered out strategies: the invasion of France, the division of Germany, the defeat of Japan. Military leaders also coordinated. Combined chiefs of staff were created to ensure that American and British forces worked seamlessly. Naval operations were synchronized, bombing campaigns shared targets, and intelligence exchanged freely. The Axis powers never achieved this level of cooperation. Hitler often dismissed his general's advice. Mussolini stumbled into disastrous campaigns, and Japan pursued its own goals. By contrast, the Allies understood that unity was survival. Propaganda and the home front unity was not just at the top. It extended to ordinary people. Allied propaganda emphasized common goals: freedom, survival, justice. In Britain, slogans like "Keep Calm" and "Carry On" boosted morale. In the United States, war bond drives and patriotic films rallied public support. In the Soviet Union, posters urged citizens to defend the motherland. Despite cultural and political differences, a shared sense of purpose emerged. This unity of spirit gave soldiers courage and civilians strength to endure hardship. By 1943, the Allied coalition was proving its worth. Together, they had stopped the Axis advance, turned the tide in key battles, and prepared for the next stage: liberation. But victory required more than unity. It required intelligence, cunning, and the ability to outthink the enemy. And what happened next would change everything. Breaking the codes, intelligence, strategy, and turning points. Victory in war is not only decided by who has the biggest armies or the most tanks. It also depends on who can outthink the other side, who can anticipate enemy moves, and who can strike at the right moment. For the Allies, intelligence and strategic decision-making became decisive weapons. From cracking secret codes to planning surprise offensives, the Allies gradually learned how to outmaneuver the Axis. This was the stage of the war where small moments of brilliance, often hidden from the public at the time, changed the fate of nations. The Secret War, Bletchley Park, and enigma deep in the English countryside. In a mansion called Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, and scientists waged a hidden battle. Their mission: to crack the German Enigma machine, a device used by the Wehrmacht to send coded messages. The Enigma was believed to be unbreakable. Each day, the Germans changed its settings, creating billions of possible combinations. But through the genius of Alan Turing and his colleagues, and with vital help from Polish cryptographers who had studied Enigma before the war, the Allies built machines that could decipher these codes. This breakthrough, known as Ultra, gave the Allies priceless knowledge. They could read German plans, track U-boats, and anticipate attacks. During the Battle of the Atlantic, Ultra allowed convoys to reroute and avoid destruction. In North Africa, it revealed Rommel's supply shortages, giving the Allies an edge at El Alamein. Churchill later said that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years. The Battle of Midway. Turning the tide in the Pacific on the other side of the world, intelligence delivered another stunning victory. After Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its navy dominated the Pacific, and its armies captured territory after territory. But American cryptographers had broken parts of Japan's naval code. In June 1942, they learned that Japan planned to attack Midway Island, a small but strategic outpost. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush. When the Japanese fleet arrived, expecting an easy victory, U.S. aircraft carriers were waiting. In a few hours, American pilots sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan lost not only ships, but also hundreds of experienced pilots. From that moment, Japan would never again have the offensive advantage. Midway proved that intelligence, combined with bold strategy, could turn the tide of war. Stalingrad, the war's deadliest battle in Europe. The turning point came in the ruins of a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. For Hitler, capturing this city meant cutting Soviet supply lines and delivering a symbolic blow. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. The battle raged from the summer of 1942 into the bitter winter of 1943. German forces advanced street by street, but the Soviets refused to give in. Snipers hunted across the rubble. Civilians fought alongside soldiers. Then came the Soviet counterstrike. Using deception and brilliant planning, the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army inside the city. Cut off from supplies, freezing and starving, over 250,000 Axis soldiers were trapped. In February 1943, the remnants surrendered. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a psychological earthquake. The myth of Nazi invincibility shattered. From then on, the Germans would be retreating. El Alamein and North Africa, while the Soviets fought at Stalingrad. The British faced the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. For years, Rommel had outmaneuvered his enemies, threatening to seize the Suez Canal and control the Middle East. But in October 1942, at El Alamein, British General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive offensive. With superior numbers of tanks, artillery, and air power supplied by American industry, the Allies pushed Rommel back. Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Soon after, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch. Caught between two fronts, the Axis forces in North Africa were crushed by 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic. Winning the lifeline for Britain, survival depended on supplies crossing the Atlantic. German U-boats sank thousands of ships, threatening to starve the island into submission. But Allied strategy slowly gained the upper hand. Convoy systems grouped merchant ships under naval escort. Long-range aircraft closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic. Radar and sonar detected submarines before they struck. And with ultra-decrypting U-boat communications, convoys could avoid danger altogether. By mid-1943, U-boat losses soared, and the Battle of the Atlantic swung decisively in the Allies' favor. The supply lines were secure, fueling the invasion of Europe. Strategic bombing. Fire from the sky, another key turning point, was the Allied bombing campaign. From 1942 onward, American and British bombers launched massive raids on German cities and factories. The strategy was controversial, especially as civilian casualties mounted. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were devastated. But bombing also crippled German production, destroyed oil supplies, and forced the Luftwaffe to fight a defensive war. By the time of the D-Day invasion in 1944, Germany's Air Force was a shadow of its former self. In Japan, American bombers brought similar devastation. The firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 killed more people than either atomic bomb. Strategic bombing, combined with naval blockades, strangled the Axis war machine. Strategy over ego. One key difference between the Allies and the Axis was leadership style. Hitler increasingly ignored his generals, issuing disastrous orders like no retreat in Stalingrad. Mussolini dragged Italy into campaigns it could not sustain. Japan gambled recklessly, overextending across Asia and the Pacific. By contrast, the Allies often argued, but they compromised and adapted. Roosevelt listened to his generals. Churchill consulted his commanders, and Stalin, though ruthless, eventually trusted his experienced marshals like Zhukov. Strategy triumphed over ego. By 1943, the war had changed. The Axis, once unstoppable, was now on the defensive. The Allies had cracked their codes, exploited their weaknesses, and seized the initiative. But intelligence and turning points alone did not end the war. The final stage required the Allies to launch massive offensives, storm enemy strongholds, and bring the Axis powers to unconditional surrender. And what happened next would change everything. The road to victory, from D-Day to Hiroshima, by 1944, the tide of World War II had turned. The Axis powers, once triumphant across continents, were now fighting desperately to hold on. The Allies had the industry, the manpower, the intelligence, and the unity to win. But victory still had to be earned on the battlefield, through invasions, brutal combat, and unimaginable destruction. This was the final stage of the war, the long and bloody road from the beaches of Normandy to the ashes of Berlin, and from the jungles of the Pacific to the mushroom clouds over Japan. D-Day, the long-awaited invasion for years, the Soviet Union had demanded a second front to relieve pressure in the East. By mid-1944, the Allies were finally ready. The target, Nazi-occupied France. The operation would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel. At dawn, soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops faced machine guns, mines, and barbed wire. At Omaha Beach, waves of men were cut down, but reinforcements kept coming. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold. Within weeks, they broke out of Normandy and raced across France. Paris was liberated in August. What Hitler had called his Atlantic Wall was breached. D-Day was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The Allies had returned to Western Europe, and Nazi Germany's days were numbered. The Eastern Front. The Red Army advances while the West pushed through France. The Soviet Union launched massive offensives in the East. Operation Bagration, in the summer of 1944, destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, shattering the Wehrmacht. City after city was liberated. Minsk, Warsaw, Budapest. The Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. For Soviet soldiers, this was more than conquest. It was revenge for the devastation inflicted on their homeland. The Eastern Front remained the war's bloodiest theater, but it was also decisive. Without the Soviet push, the Allies might have faced years more of grinding combat. The fall of Germany by early 1945, Allied armies closed in on Germany from both west and east. American and British forces crossed the Rhine, while the Soviets pressed from Poland. German cities lay in ruins, their people starving, their armies exhausted. In April, Soviet troops encircled Berlin. Street fighting raged as Hitler's regime collapsed. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his bunker. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Celebrations erupted from London to Moscow to New York. But in the Pacific, the struggle was far from finished. The Pacific War, island by island defeating Japan, required a different kind of warfare. The Pacific was vast, dotted with heavily fortified islands. The United States adopted a strategy of island hopping, capturing key positions while bypassing others. Battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima were fought at staggering cost. Japanese defenders often refused to surrender, fighting to the last man. Civilians, indoctrinated with fear of the Allies, sometimes took their own lives rather than be captured. At sea, the U.S. Navy gained dominance. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan's fleet was effectively destroyed. American bombers could now strike the Japanese home islands directly. Yet even as defeat loomed, Japan's leaders clung to hope. They turned to kamikaze tactics, sending pilots on suicide missions to crash into Allied ships. Though terrifying, these desperate measures could not change the outcome. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final shock by summer 1945, Japan faced destruction. Its cities had been firebombed, its navy sunk, its people starving. Still, its leaders refused unconditional surrender. The planned invasion of Japan promised to be one of the bloodiest battles in history. American generals predicted millions of casualties. But the Allies had a weapon unlike any seen before, the atomic bomb. Developed in secret under the Manhattan Project, it harnessed the power of the atom to unleash unimaginable destruction. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In an instant, tens of thousands were killed. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Faced with annihilation, Japan finally surrendered on August 15th. World War II was over. The aftermath and legacy of the war had lasted 6 years, consumed entire nations, and killed over 70 million people. Cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, and countless families broken. Yet the reasons for Allied victory were clear. Industry gave them the weapons, ships, and planes to outproduce the Axis. Unity allowed democracies, empires, and even communists to fight together. Intelligence and strategy helped them outthink their enemies at critical moments. Courage and sacrifice, from the streets of Stalingrad to the sands of Normandy, ensured that tyranny would not prevail. The Allies did not win quickly nor easily. They won because they combined resources, adapted to challenges, and never surrendered to despair. The Axis powers, divided by arrogance and ideology, could not match that determination. World War II reshaped the world. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Europe lay divided, and the shadow of nuclear weapons would hang over humanity for decades. Yet one truth remained. In the greatest conflict of history, the Allies had prevailed. And what happened next, the Cold War, decolonization, the rebuilding of nations, would shape the modern age. And that is the incredible story of how the Allies won World War II. A war that reshaped nations, redrew maps, and defined the modern world. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which battle or moment do you think was the true turning point of World War II? Drop your answer in the comments below, and let's start the discussion. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the world we live in today.